Chapter 24 of The Man with the Red Beard by David Whitelaw. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Marianne. Chapter 24. A Little Lunch in Soho. Perhaps, in this world, there is nothing more irksome than the hours of forced inactivity which precede an event of importance. I told myself, when I woke the morning after my visit to Hampstead, that I should find it a hard matter to get through the day until the evening should bring me again to the Heath and Myra. I said that the first thing to do was to start the day as late as possible, and for that reason I rang and had coffee and rolls, for my travels have taught me continental ideas and matutinal diet, placed with the morning papers on a little table at my bedside. There was no post. No one save Winston and Myra knew of Sammy Mannering's arrival, and Simon Draffo naturally had no correspondence. I lay there in the genial morning sunshine which came in at the open window and listened to the sounds of life in the street below, the rattle of the cabs and the cries of the street vendors. The papers contained nothing of interest to me, or, rather, nothing of use to me. The Park Lane burglary was still the main theme of all the journals, and I smiled as I read the sensational deductions of the leader writers and the alarmist letters in the correspondence columns. Some of these were far nearer the mark than the writers were aware. About 11 I got up, and after dressing lazily, made my way through the Bloomsbury Squares until I found myself at the end of Tottenham Court Road, and so along the Euston Road and into Regent's Park, there to walk up and down ruminating on the events which had happened since my arrival in London. I was glad to find that the brisk exercise had a beneficial effect on my brain, and that I could think more clearly than I had been able to while lying in bed. I paced the long gravelled walks hardly conscious of my surroundings, cudgelling the grey matter behind my forehead for a way in which I could extract the girl I loved from the meshes of the net in which she had found herself. I chose a deserted walk, where there was nothing to disturb my thoughts save an occasional nursemaid passing with her charges, or the roar of some imprisoned beast in the zoological gardens near by. I knew that while the group to which Myra had given her support and sympathies had existence, she would never be safe from the effects of the vows she had taken, and if the group ceased to exist, if it were wiped out, what, I asked, was to become of Myra? I had ideas of going to the police and of giving information which would put them on the track of the house at Norwood, that there might be papers there of a nature to incriminate the girl, and again, the role of an informer was not one that appealed to me. Bayliss, at any rate, was by way of being my friend, and I did not like to think of the poor little rat in the hands of the police, through any doing of mine. Further, I must be careful how I attacked Merzef. Would not any act against him bring the whole of the Norwood clique tumbling about our ears? I knew that Felix, if he must fall, was not the man to fall alone. Myra must be my first care. Disgusted as she had shown herself to be at the degeneration that had turned the cause she loved into one of robbery and murder, she was nevertheless bound to it as strongly as though her heart were still in its doctrines. I knew enough of the Brotherhood to know that the vows taken by its members were till death. I had gathered from my perusal of the morning papers a fairly complete reconstruction of the affair at St. Boris Fenberg's. Beyond the man who was dead, there had apparently been two others. Doubtless they were the two men I had seen on the night of my visit to Celerina Villa. The burglary had to a certain extent been successful, although the men had been disturbed before they had been able to annex the main object of their crime, the Azov diamond. The two men who had made their escape had not done so empty-handed. I judged that these men had been waiting in the garden while their comrade went back to make a last search for the gem, which, by the way, was at the Russian financier's bankers during the owner's stay in Scotland. I think that when the caretaker gave the alarm, it must have reached the waiting men in the garden, and that they judged it wise to waste no time over their departure for safer ground. The garden of the Park Lane house is well planted with shrubs, and when, after the death of Stepanovitch, on the balcony, these gardens came to be searched, the police found plenty of evidence that a couple of men had trodden their way over the soft mould of the flower-beds, skirting the high brick wall that ran round the gardens, also that the marks were made by boots of foreign manufacture. The footsteps came to an end at a thick plantation of rhododendrons, the shrubs being in such dense masses that tracking here was out of the question. The walls surrounding the garden did not show any signs of having been clambered over, and the house and grounds were patrolled and the search kept up for some hours without success. It became certain that the miscreants had made good their escape. It was thought that they had taken advantage of the fight their comrade was putting up at the front of the house, and in the excitement had perhaps been able to mingle with the crowd which quickly gathered. I wondered what had become of the booty secured. I had read the full list of stolen articles published by Scotland Yard: jewels, snuff-boxes, miniatures, and a large sum of money in gold and notes. No doubt, I said, Felix Marazeff and the worthy doctor at Norwood, after paying their dupes the wages of their crime, would find good use for the money they would obtain for the expropriated articles. I wondered how much would find its way to Russia, unless it was into Marazev's account in the Bank of Moscow. The nearest these treasures would get to the peasants of the Tsar would probably be the house of some fence in Rotterdam. Suddenly I remembered that I had made a semi-promise to Monsieur Bellas that I would lunch with him, provided he chose a more appetizing restaurant than the one he habitually used. I am afraid I did not look forward, gastronomically, to the event, but I felt that any time spent in the society of one of the revolutionaries was not wasted. Far better, I said, than pacing the gravelled walks of Regent's Park, grappling with unsolvable problems. There was plenty of time, I saw, by looking at my watch, and I took a cab from the rank at the park entrance and drove to the Marble Arch. A fancy had come to me to take a look at the scene of the outrage with which I seemed to be so mixed up. I remembered my last visit to the house of Sir Boris Fenberg, during which Paul Bergstoff was waiting in the Barbarians' Club. I called to mind the mixed reception the nasty little Russian financier had accorded me, and I could not find it in my heart to pity him the loss of his jewels and snuff-boxes. I took the path which runs parallel to the lane, but just within the railings of the park. If I had not already been acquainted with the residence of the Russian, I could have easily picked it out by the knot of curious people who stood in the roadway and gaped at its windows. The house was but 2 stories high, and painted white. This, together with the red-striped sun-blinds, gave it, in the noon sun, a dazzling effect that was almost painful to the eye. A broad sweep of carriage drive semicircled to the great pillars of the porch, and the gardens facing the road were gay with flowers and shrubs. 2 or 3 policemen stood guard outside the big wrought-iron gates. There were but few evidences of the fight for the crowd to feast its eyes upon, but I noticed that a man was working, reglazing the window which gave on to the farther end of the balcony, and it was here, I said, screened by the banks of flowers, that the man I had seen in Moscow and at Norwood had made his last stand. I could see in my mind the savage face of Stepanovitch, with its long wisp of black hair and maniacal eyes, peering through its ambush of blossom. Well, I could feel no sorrow at his death, although, as Simon Draffo, I had hailed him as a comrade. I am afraid that the sympathy I had felt for those in Russia who were working for the regeneration of their country was fast melting away under the influence of English conditions and the evident self-seeking of the gang I had been introduced to in Norwood. I knew that in the higher branches of intellectual anarchists, expropriation had no part except under peculiar conditions. Violence, yes, and death to those who, having been tried by their tribunal, were found to be unworthy of life. Very few thus sentenced, but for their one wretched life had sacrificed hundreds of innocent ones. Expropriation of government money had, I knew, been looked upon, when funds were low, as a necessity. These exploits had been carried out tactfully and mercifully. I had heard of a boat conveying the mails, among which were the collected taxes of harassed villages, being held up on the Volga, and the taxes recollected by the representatives of the Nihilists. But the expropriation had respected the lives and the property of private persons, and the ordinary mails remained untouched, only the money of the Tsar, to which the Nihilist believed he had no right, being taken by them. I am afraid that the men at Norwood had no such scruples. From what I had gathered in my talk with Myra, burglary was openly discussed and planned among them, and that human life was held very lightly, were the success of their enterprises involved. Marazeff, I knew, thought little of murder, and it was hardly likely he would restrain the gang of wolves who did his bidding. I did not remain with the crowd. One glance at Sir Boris Fenberg's mansion was all that I allowed myself. Then I walked slowly on, down Piccadilly, and through the crowded streets to the garlic-impregnated atmosphere of Soho. I was most agreeably surprised to find that the restaurant to which I had been bidden by Bellas was quite respectable, and, the walk having given me a keen appetite, I found myself looking forward to the meal with something akin to pleasure. If its cooking and service proved as clean as its white-curtained windows, it would suit Samuel Mannering. I was a few minutes behind my time, and when I entered, the Rat was already at a table, his serviette tucked in at his neck, and watching the door with anxious eyes. He seemed to me somehow different, a trifle paler than usual. Facing him, with his back towards me, was Felix Marazeff. I think that, had it been possible, I would have retreated. But Bellis had already caught sight of me, and I had no time to go back. After a moment's deliberation, I had no desire to do so. The Rat had jumped up from his seat and was holding a chair out for me. Felix Marazeff watched our meeting, but from the one glance I took at his face I could tell nothing. He was rolling a cigarette as I greeted Bellis, and it seemed to me that he took more interest in his occupation than in my arrival. When he looked up his expression was non-committal. His eyes held the polite interest of one who waits for an introduction. I have ever been one to carry the war into the enemy's camp, so I did not give Monsieur Bellis time for an introduction, but held out a hand to Felix, smiling at the same time, and giving him ample opportunity to notice the little pieces of gold filling that I had inserted between my teeth. "I have had the honour, I think, in Moscow, was it not?" I said. "There were so many there that night that you will not remember Simon Draffo. I was from Geneva." I spoke in fluent Russian. Felix Marazeff in all his replies, and indeed in all his actions, was inscrutable. At the mention of my name he shook his head with a little smile. He did not think he had had the pleasure to meet Monsieur Draffo, although one of the men present had mentioned the name to him. The affair of the police had happened so suddenly that the name had been driven from his mind. Draffo. Yes, he remembered it perfectly now, and was pleased to meet the owner of it. He congratulated me on my escape from the flat. There are very few, alas, who are so fortunate. At one time I wondered if the man was playing with me. Again I told myself that it was impossible. Surely no man was capable of such perfect acting. Since the first shock of the sight of him, my nerves had come nobly to my assistance, and I welcomed and prepared to make much of the chance that had come to me. After all, the meeting had to come some day, better sooner than later. The man had evidently not accompanied the Rat to the restaurant, for he had all but finished his meal when I came in. On his plate was the litter of dessert and ashes of his cigarette. A little glass of cognac stood beside his empty coffee-cup. He spoke to me in a low voice of the movement in Russia, and I could well understand the hold he had over the revolutionaries. Knowing him for the Judas he was, it was amazing to notice the fire and fanaticism that lit up his face as he declaimed against the Tsar and his works. He asked sympathetically of the Geneva branch of the order. It seemed that he had paid them a visit a little while after the fall of the Moscow patriots, and 2 months later that same Geneva branch had been broken up by the Swiss police. I think I understood how their fate had come about. And all the time we were talking, Monsieur Bellis was content to sit silent and drink his claret and listen. It was evident that, to him, Marazeff was as a being apart, and I could see by the little attentions he gave him that he either held his chief in great respect or in great fear, or, perhaps, in a great hatred. For some 20 minutes Felix remained with us. Then, glancing at the clock on the green-washed wall of the room, he called the waiter and paid his bill. The Rat stood as the other rose from his seat and helped the man with the red beard into his coat. Felix Marazeff had finished his cigarette, and as he held out his hand to bid me good-bye, I noticed that an unlit cigar was between his teeth. I rather wondered at the vulgarity of the man who had omitted to remove the gaudy gilt of a red band from his cigar. After all, Marazeff, in as far as I had seen him, was a polished rogue, and lacked nothing in the manners which go to the making of a gentleman. I was soon to know that even in little matters, such as the band of a cigar, the man with the red beard did not act without a reason. He held my hand for a moment in his, which even on this summer day was cold and clammy. "It has given me great pleasure, Monsieur Draffo," he said, "to have made your acquaintance. My heart still bleeds for the heroes who lost their lives on that night in Moscow, and it is good to meet one whom I thought was dead." "And I, Monsieur Marazeff," I said, "am glad to meet you, and honoured. Believe me, your name is often spoken amongst the brothers in Geneva. I am deeply sorry to hear that the little band there has met with disaster. I was afraid something was wrong. I have not heard news of their movements for so long." Marazeff sighed and threw out his hands with a fateful gesture. "Ah, monsieur," he said, "we take our lives in our hands when we work for the good of humanity. It is a dangerous game, Monsieur Draffo." And with a little bow which embraced both the Rat and myself, he walked from the restaurant. I watched him from the window, and he did not look back. Also, I saw him stop a few doors away and remove the band from his cigar. End of chapter 24.